Good afternoon. Welcome to the last event in the Center for Humanities Pop Culture Lecture Series. My name is Katie McIntyre. I'm from Gender and Women's Studies, and I'm filling in today for the Center for Humanities Director, Professor Eve Stern. Eve Stern just published an award-winning book, House of David, and she's doing a book tour in Michigan. So she asked me to introduce the person who's going to be introducing our speaker today. So, important role. I'm happy. First, I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the Division of Research and Economic Development. I'm also thrilled to announce that the Center for Humanities has chosen the theme for next year. It's going to be the American Revolution to commemorate, of course, the 250th anniversary. The first speaker of the fall semester will be Robert Parkinson from SUNY Binghamton, and he is the author of 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, among many other books. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague from the Department of English to introduce this evening's speaker. Professor Travis Williams specializes in Shakespeare and early modern literature. Here at URI, he teaches courses on authors and works throughout that period, as well as topics in literature and science. His current book project is titled Literature and Mathematics, The Writing Arts and the Age of Shakespeare. Please welcome Professor Williams.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Rhode Island and to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson comes to us from Harvard University, where he deploys deep experience in the scholarship of teaching and learning as director of the Harvard Law School Writing Center. He also currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the journal Public Humanities and as a lecturer in the Harvard Extension School. Educated at San Diego State University and the University of California at Irvine, Dr. Wilson has amassed an impressive record of scholarship and as a public intellectual on Shakespeare as a brand, as a cultural avatar, as a social and political touchstone, as one of the few constants in the ever-changing zeitgeist. Dr. Wilson has examined these phenomena from many angles, finding, for example, that Shakespeare's current omnipresence is due, at least in part, to the appeal of his ironic mode to liberal, anti-authoritarian political tastemakers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. With the felicitous coinage of the Shakespeare, Dr. Wilson probes the pervasiveness of Shakespeare both in his adored presence and avoidant absence. As he told CNN several years ago, quote, elisions, refractions, speculative biographies, theatrical afterlives, these Shakespearean adaptations capitalize on the playwright's cultural prominence to generate an audience, but dodge his actual plays and poems. The push and pull of Shakespeare in these adaptations reflects the simultaneous nausea and enthusiasm many feel towards the author. In recent years, Dr. Wilson has developed this thinking in three impressive monographs: Shakespeare and Game of Thrones, Shakespeare and Trump, and, most recently, Richard III's Bodies from Medieval England to Modernity, Shakespeare and Disability History. Today's talk shares a title with a course Dr. Wilson teaches at Harvard and has done so an astonishing 31 times. We are now to benefit from that experimentation and experience. So, why Shakespeare? Let's find out. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Wilson.
Thank you very much, Travis, Katie, Eve, Adam, everyone, for joining us here today on April 23rd, Shakespeare's birthday, we think. The MLA International Bibliography contains about 50,021 items about Shakespeare, nearly 4 times as many as the next most popular author, Joyce, followed in order by Dante, Goethe, Chaucer, Milton, Dickens, Cervantes, James, Faulkner, Woolf, and the rest. Shakespeare, we've been told, is extremely important, and you may agree or disagree with that, but do you know why Shakespeare matters to so many people? The most prolific literary critic of the 20th century, Harold Bloom, argued that it's because Shakespeare invented the human. The director of the biggest Shakespeare library in the world, Farrah Karim Cooper, thinks it's because he's the great white bard. For Bloom, there is something intrinsic to Shakespeare, something unique that makes him better than other writers. With Easter approaching, I've been thinking about our own secular god, William Shakespeare. Robert David Jaffe wrote in the Huffington Post in April 2014 when there were global celebrations of Shakespeare's 450th birthday. Shakespeare's work is so prolific and his cognitive and aesthetic powers so original and unsurpassed, one might very well ask whether Shakespeare is indeed God. In contrast, for Cooper, Shakespeare's prominence stems from external forces working down upon him. Universal my toe, Emma O'Toole wrote in The Guardian. After the World Shakespeare Festival in 2012, when thousands of theater artists from around the world pilgrimaged to the UK to stage 70 productions for more than 1 million people as part of a cultural Olympiad held in connection with the Olympics in London. Why do the people the world over study and perform Shakespeare? Colonialism. That's where, and that's why. Today, I invite Shakespeare lovers and Shakespeare haters alike to consider the question of Shakespeare's popularity by merging the intrinsic argument with the extrinsic approach, by looking at the relationship between Shakespeare's methods of artistic creation and the values of the modern world. We will use statistics and sociology to map Shakespeare's pathways through modernity. We'll see that Shakespeare's popularity grows less from the literary quality of his texts and more from the depth and variety of problems, textual, thematic, and ethical, in them. To get a sense of our method, let's start with a poll. So who read Shakespeare in high school? Or whatever form of secondary education you went to. Maybe my question should be, who was assigned to read Shakespeare in high school? So quick show of hands here. Okay, so we've got some data. So that's 100%, or pretty close to it, of us were assigned to read Shakespeare in high school. We've established a fact, but that fact calls out for explanation. Why were we assigned to read Shakespeare in high school? The question is not, should Shakespeare be popular in high school? That's an ethical question about what we should do. Not interested. I don't care if you read more Shakespeare. I don't think he'll save your life. I'm interested in analytical questions about what is true, how our reality came to be, and why. So the question is, why is Shakespeare popular in high school? One reason is that Shakespeare is one of the very few authors called for by name in the Common Core state standards, a set of academic benchmarks for what K through 12 students are expected to know. But a follow-up question can help us get some more data. So which of Shakespeare's texts were you assigned to read in high school? Just shout out some titles. Yep. So a 2025 study from the National Council of Teachers of English revealed that Romeo and Juliet is the most popular text assigned in high school, and that Shakespeare wrote 3 of the top 10 texts, the others being Macbeth in 4th place and Hamlet in 8th. A 1989 study, it was Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and Hamlet in the top 10. In 1964, it was Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and Hamlet. So 2 observations. First, Romeo and Juliet went from not even registering in the top 10 in 1964 to being number 1 in 1989. Why? So what happened in the last quarter of the 20th century that led to the rise of Romeo and Juliet? And that's also interesting considering a study showing that Hamlet is far and away the most popular text for scholars to write about. But I would hypothesize that academics love Hamlet and teenagers love Romeo and Juliet for the same reason. They make their daily monotony feel epic. The second observation is that when we say Shakespeare is popular in high school, that's not really true. Only certain Shakespearean texts are popular. It's not the comedies, it's not the histories, it's the tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, and Julius Caesar are the big 4. So we've now got a better question than what we started out with. Why is Shakespearean tragedy popular in high school? What we're asking is, how is value determined? So consider the dollar bill. How much is this worth? $1. But why is it worth $1? It's not just arbitrary, right? There's a reason that this piece of paper is worth $1 and not big red rubber bouncy balls, because it would be incredibly inconvenient for us to carry around a bunch of big red rubber bouncy balls all the time, right? So there are intrinsic qualities of this object that come into contact with external forces working upon it that result in its value. A simple equation. A plus B equals C. where A is the intrinsic qualities of something, B is the external forces working upon it, and C is its cultural value. So what are A, the features of Shakespearean tragedy that come into contact with B, the needs of high school teachers and administrators, to produce C, the popularity of Shakespearean tragedy in U.S. high school? What needs and desires of the U.S. high school system does Shakespearean tragedy satisfy? When we ask the question of value, we could ask this about anything. The Mona Lisa, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Super Bowl, Taylor Swift, Oprah. Anything that is popular is so because some intrinsic qualities of that cultural object supply something that fills a demand in the culture in question. And the high school example shows that the why question becomes clearer when we ask the how question. So we have to ask how Shakespeare has lived on in modern life after his death. In the 1530s, Henry VIII declares England an empire. Soon, like other empires in history, England goes looking for a literary figurehead to stand as its poet laureate. Traditionally, such figureheads were epic poets who celebrated the founding of the culture, Homer for ancient Greece, Virgil for the Roman Empire, and Dante for the Holy Roman Empire. Masters Gower, Chaucer, and Lidget were dubbed the premier poets of this nation as early as 1475. Early 16th century poets like John Skelton often repeated this roll call, trying to write themselves into it, and that's the conversation that Shakespeare was born into. Not many documents about Shakespeare's life survive, which is standard for someone from a working class family, in contrast to the aristocrats whose lives are better documented. We don't know for sure when Shakespeare was born, but we do know that he was christened on April 26, 1564, and we know that christenings usually happened within 3 days after birth, so Shakespeare's birthday is celebrated on April 23rd, which happens to be St. George's Day in England, where they celebrate their national saint, lending to the notion that Shakespeare is himself a secular saint. He is the third of 8 children of John Shakespeare, a glover and local politician, and Mary Arden, daughter of an affluent landowning farmer. On November 27, 1582, an 18-year-old William Shakespeare and a 26-year-old Anne Hathaway apply for a marriage license. Conspicuously fewer than 9 months later, their daughter Susanna is christened on May 26, 1583, so it was a shotgun wedding. Twins Hamnet and Judith are christened on February 2nd, 1585. And then Shakespeare disappears for 7 years, which, if we combine all the theories together, during this time he became a deer-poaching fugitive on the lam from the law while simultaneously prepping and teaching class every day for young students and secretly converting to Catholicism while in Italy, both learning European geography and serving as a government spy. Oh, and by the way, his identity was stolen by Sir Francis Bacon, as well as the Earls of Derby, Oxford, and Neville. The first reference to Shakespeare in London comes in 1592. It's not very flattering. Robert Greene, an established playwright, complains there's an upstart crow beautified with our feathers that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, quote from one of Shakespeare's plays, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, being an absolute Johannes factotum, a jack of all trades, is in his own conceit the only Shake scene in a country. There are a few more records and surviving documents, but there's really not much, and that absence of concrete information about Shakespeare's life has allowed people to do all sorts of imaginative recreations with it, filling in the gaps. A 1979 British TV series called William Shakespeare asked, what if England's favorite son was actually the trans-mad scientist from the Rocky Horror Picture Show? 1998's Shakespeare in Love swept the Oscars by suggesting that the Elizabethan theater was just Hollywood without electricity and Ben Affleck's terrible English accent. The British sitcom Upstart Crow, which appeared in 2016, irreverently just made up things about Shakespeare's life, but it drew the line at the enormous forehead. That we must preserve.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Dad, nobody talks like this.
It's poetry.
I do think it could be a little less flowery, love. I mean, why doesn't she just say, where are you, Romeo?
It doesn't mean where are you, it means why are you, Romeo?
That's a bit weird.
Upstart Crow on BBC Two.
The 2011 film Anonymous mounted an insidious campaign against facts, complete with teaching guides under the conspiracy theorist's favorite guise of what? We can't ask questions? 2017's Will on TNT hypothesized that Shakespeare was super into steampunk.
You can't just make up words! Someone must. This is William Shakespeare. Ready for the slaughter. Sharpen thy wit, butcher. Whether fine-feathered or the most common of birds, to wing our way to heaven, all we need are words.
So that was canceled after one season. In 2018, All Is True about a retired Shakespeare was made to give Kenneth Branagh something to do whilst too old to play Romeo, Hamlet, and Macbeth, but not old enough for King Lear. And in 2026's Hamlet, Shakespeare's wife Agnes fulfills the fantasy of every U.S. high school student by trying to punch Shakespeare in the face. Just think how different English literature might have been if that right hook connected. In London, Shakespeare was popular in his own day, but not astronomically. He got mixed reviews from his peers. In 1598, a contemporary critic wrote that as Plautus and Seneca are accounted the best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare among the English is the most excellent in both kinds for the stage. For comedy, witness his Gentleman of Verona, his Errors, his Love's Labour's Lost, his Love's Labour's Won, his Midsummer Night's Dream, and his Merchant of Venice. For tragedy, his Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and his Romeo and Juliet. Another critic said, the younger sort takes much delight in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, but his Lucrece and his tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, have it in them to please the wiser sort. Initially, people knew Shakespeare more for his poetry than for his plays. His most popular work in quarto editions, the small editions, was Venus and Adonis, a poem. Two of his top three works were poems, the other one being The Rape of Lucrece. His most popular play in print was the first part of Henry IV. Three of Shakespeare's four most popular plays were histories, and 6 of his top 9 plays were histories. It was the history plays about English kings, not the tragedies or the comedies, that made Shakespeare famous. History was Shakespeare's most popular genre in his own day, with 39 editions, followed in order by tragedy with 23 editions, comedy with 14, and romance with 6. The tragedies that we associate with him now were relatively less popular. Hamlet was in 7th place of all of Shakespeare's works, Romeo and Juliet in 8th place, King Lear in 15th place. The history play was not a well-established genre prior to Shakespeare. Though there are earlier examples, such as John Bayle's King John around 1538 and Thomas Lake's Richard III in 1579, so around 1586, an anonymous early history play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, is performed. A year later, Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine the Great, a history play about the Persian emperor, is staged in 2 parts. Around 1589, there's another anonymous King John play, and then Marlowe's Tamburlaine is published in 2 parts in 1590, creating a market for 2-part history plays. Around 1590, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and others together write the play we now call Henry VI Part 2. 1591 brings Marlowe's Edward II. As a sequel to that earlier Henry VI play, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and others write the play we now call Henry VI Part 3. Then, all by himself, Shakespeare writes Richard III, a sequel to those earlier Henry VI plays, making a trilogy, and Richard III is a huge hit. So Marlowe, Thomas Nash, maybe Shakespeare, or maybe his editions came later, probably others, then write the play we now call Henry VI Part 1. So that's a prequel to those earlier parts 2 and 3 of Henry VI. It's a huge success. This makes a tetralogy of plays. Henry VI Parts 1, 2, and 3, and then Richard III tell a continuous epic story. 1592 also brings Edward III, a sequel to Marlowe's earlier Edward II. It's published anonymously. Kidd, Marlowe, and Peele have been suggested as authors. We think that Shakespeare wrote 2 or 3 scenes in this play. In the 1594 to 95 season, all 3 of the Henry VI plays are performed, and then Shakespeare writes Richard II by himself, starting a sequence of 4 history plays known as his second tetralogy, which is a prequel to the first tetralogy, the Henry VI and Richard III plays. Shakespeare does a brief digression over to write his own King John play, based on the earlier version that's now a prequel to Marlowe's Edward II. And then in 1596, Shakespeare writes the sequel to Richard III, Henry IV, Part 1. Then comes another sequel, Henry IV, Part 2. And finally, Henry V, the last play in Shakespeare's second tetralogy. It's the sequel to the earlier Henry IV plays, and then it's also Shakespeare's last history play until at the end of his career he writes Henry VIII nearly 15 years later. So before Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, there is in circulation in London an epic set of English history plays that tell the story of what's called the Plantagenet Empire that brought about the reigning House of Tudor. It's no exaggeration to say that the reason Shakespeare rose to fame in the 1590s and the reason his great tragedies of the 1600s had an audience in the first place is because of his role in the dramatization of his nation's royal history during a time when the British Empire was quickly becoming a global superpower. The Brits needed an epic poet to tell the story of their foundation, and Shakespeare was their guy, but he told it in drama rather than in epic poetry. Source study shows that Shakespeare regularly removed any trace of a strong, central, single, authorial voice engineering the meaning and values of his texts. So at the start of the true tragedy of Richard III, one of Shakespeare's sources for his version, a character named Poetry comes out and tells a character named Truth to tell the story of the Wars of the Roses, and then Truth speaks. Shakespeare cut Truth out of Richard III. Arthur Brooks's Romeo and Juliet from 1562 includes 3 prefaces that domineer the meaning of the story, claiming that it gives, quote, ministering matter for God's goodness, wisdom, and power. Shakespeare took God out of Romeo and Juliet. He took out of Hamlet the motive for feigning madness that is provided in Shakespeare's source. Creating ambiguity by suppressing motives present in his sources became Shakespeare's favorite strategy for creating compelling tragedy. In Othello, he removed Iago's love for Desdemona. In King Lear, he took out Lear's recently deceased wife and the explanation for the love test. In Macbeth, he cut Macbeth's legitimate claim to the throne of Scotland. Shakespeare also took away from later comedies the voice that ought to assure us that everything is all right. Both Isabella in Measure for Measure and Hermione in The Winter's Tale remain silent when claims for comic restoration are advanced. Shakespeare's strategic silences impose a burden of resolution on the audience. Is Bolingbroke's rebellion justified? Is The Merchant of Venice anti-Semitic? Is Falstaff the problem or the answer? Is Henry V the national hero or a Machiavellian hypocrite? Is the assassination of Caesar principled or idiotic? Is Coriolanus more sinned against than sinning? And who's worse, Prospero or Caliban? It's not immediately obvious why Shakespeare so stubbornly refused to tell audiences what to do or think. His contemporaries did it all the time. This approach, associated with active learning in our time, is at least as old as the Socratic method. So the Socratic method works through pretended ignorance. That's what irony means, is pretended ignorance. Socrates asks people questions. What do you think? In contrast to a teaching style like Aristotle, where he expounds each aspect of an idea in order so that you can learn it. Ironia Socratica was rediscovered in the Renaissance thanks to the increased circulation of classical authors like Cicero and Quintilian, who commented on Socrates' irony. Renaissance writers like Petrarch and Erasmus identified Socratic irony as a sustained mode of discourse associated with the rhetorical tradition of argument in utrumque partem on both sides of an issue. As a key to the educational curriculum in Elizabethan grammar schools, argument in utrumque partem contributed to a shift in England from homiletic to exploratory drama, as Joel Altman argues. The plays are essentially questions and not statements. The plays functioned as media of intellectual and emotional exploration for minds that were accustomed to explore the many sides of a given theme to entertain opposing ideals. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation, accompanied by the dissemination of printed Bibles, encouraged individual interpretations and called into question the authoritative control of meaning claimed by the Catholic Church. I suspect that Shakespeare's attitude toward the interpretability of things, as cultivated by his religious setting and rhetorical training, drew him toward drama, which, through its absence of a central narrative voice, encourages an interrogative rather than declarative posture toward its audience, ironic rather than didactic. The Elizabethans elevated Chaucer and Gower above Lidget and Skelton while adding one of their own, Spenser. The The remarkable literary output of the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages blew the early English canon wide open. So claims were made for Philip Sidney, Samuel Daniel, William Shakespeare, Francis Beaumont, John Fletcher, Michael Drayton, and Ben Jonson, among others. We think, perhaps, the first international Shakespearean production occurred in 1607 on the Red Dragon, a ship. Hamlet, and then 3 weeks later, Richard II, while the ship was anchored off the coast of Sierra Leone, but that story may have been made up in the 19th century. Even within Shakespeare's own lifetime, people were already adapting his plays. John Fletcher's The Woman's Prize, or The Tamer Tamed, in 1611, is the first Shakespearean adaptation, and it takes issue with the retrograde sexism in Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Shakespeare dies at the age of 52 in 1616. At his death, he gets a humble gravestone in the church at Stratford-upon-Avon. The epitaph says, "Good friends, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." But we've been moving Shakespeare's bones ever since then. There were friends like Ben Jonson, who celebrated him as the greatest of his time. Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage, my Shakespeare, rise. In Jonson's eulogy, Shakespeare's already connected to British imperialism. Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time. Shakespeare's funerary monument was built at the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford sometime before 1623. Then in 1623, 7 years after his death, what's called Shakespeare's first folio is published, a first collected works. At that time, when the great English writers were named, it was Chaucer, Gower, Lidget, Thomas More, and for our time, not Shakespeare, but Sir Philip Sidney was the glory of our clime. A man named Thomas Dekker was the most popular author on the early modern stage, his 80 recorded performances far surpassing the second most popular, John Fletcher, who had 65. James Shirley, Philip Massinger, and Shakespeare round out the top 5 most popular early English dramatists. Shakespeare's ranking at number 5 places him right in the middle between the other names that are usually mentioned in the same breath as him, John Fletcher at number 2 and Ben Jonson at number 9. So Shakespeare was indeed verifiably popular on the early modern stage, but not uniquely or overwhelmingly so. In 1640, John Benson's edition of Shakespeare's sonnets removes allusions to bisexuality and homosexuality. In 1641, the theaters in England are shut down for 20 years during a time of civil war. Shakespeare's always been the most popular Renaissance dramatist in print, in contrast on stage in print, except for a brief period from the 1640s to the 1660s, which corresponds to the English Civil Wars, the Interregnum, and the first decade of the Restoration. So what's up with this period where Shakespeare was not popular? The Puritans, who hated the theater, dethroned and executed King Charles I in 1649 in a very theatrical way. Puritan polemicist John Milton's Iconoclastes critiqued King Charles by comparing him to Shakespeare's Richard III. After Milton goes on to write the greatest epic poem in English language, Paradise Lost, many thought that he was destined to be England's prized poet. Milton himself thought that he was destined to be England's prized poet. In 1660, Charles II is restored to the throne and opens the theaters back up. No one had been writing plays for 20 years, though, so they turned to many 50-year-old plays, including Shakespeare's. The first major English production to feature female actors was a production of Othello on December 8th, 1860, and yes, there were nipples. John Fletcher dominated the Restoration stage. With 191 recorded performances between 1660 and 1700, Fletcher was really just in a league of his own above Shakespeare's 109 performances. John Dryden said that Beaumont and Fletcher were the most pleasant and frequent entertainments of the stage, 2 of theirs being acted through the year for one of Shakespeare's or Jonson's. Shakespeare's plays were often altered, including politically, to suit the conservative Restoration government dominant at the time. King Lear and Romeo and Juliet were given happy endings. Macbeth and The Tempest were made into operas. Shakespeare was often attacked, as in Thomas Rymer's racist 1692 attack on Othello, because he thought a black war hero was improbable. The character of the state of Venice is to employ strangers in their wars, but shall a poet thence fancy that they will send a Negro to be their general, or trust a Moor to defend them against the Turk? With us, a black Moor might rise to be a trumpeter, but Shakespeare would not have him less than a lieutenant general. Nothing is more odious in nature than an improbable lie, and certainly never was any play fraught like this of Othello with improbabilities. Traumatized by the horrors of the English Civil War and the uncertainties of the interregnum, Restoration Englishmen held a deep desire for order, and Shakespeare was relatively unpopular during this period because he was seen as a poet of disorder. Shakespeare only became the most popular Renaissance dramatist in the final decade of the 17th century. But Dryden still thought that the English have only to boast of Spenser and Milton, not Shakespeare, to have been perfect poets. Shakespeare had a huge presence in the rise of naturalistic painting in the 18th century, including William Hogarth's Falstaff examining his troops around 1730 and a scene from The Tempest around 1735. By the mid-18th century, the roll call of early English authors showed a consensus: Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. According to Google's Ngram viewer, Milton was more popular than Shakespeare up to the 1790s. And then Shakespeare jockeys with Milton for a little bit, and then closer to the 20th century, Shakespeare clearly emerges as the more popular of the two. But even in 1740, Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey put Shakespeare in the center, making an argument about his centrality. Shakespeare's rising fortunes were aided by the creation of several editions of finely curated complete works, and you really don't see this many editions of other early English writers. The most important is Samuel Johnson's 1765 edition. 20 years earlier, Johnson had published the first modern dictionary, which is loaded with examples of word usage from Shakespeare. When you hear people talk about Shakespeare invented a whole bunch of words, actually Johnson just included a whole bunch of Shakespeare in his dictionary. Shakespeare's works received so many 18th century editions not because they were loved, but because they had so many holes. There were so many competing texts. There were so many uncertainties. There were so many moments that gave people pause that needed to be explained. That's why Shakespeare got so much attention in the 18th century. Continental philosophers such as Voltaire in France and Johann von Goethe in Germany started writing about Shakespeare. Jubilees began celebrating Shakespeare's birthday and idolizing him as the best that England had ever produced. David Garrick can worship at the first Shakespeare Jubilee. 'Tis he, that demigod, 'tis he, the god of our idolatry. An 18th century feminist London collective called the Blue Stocking Society loved Shakespeare. One of the Blue Stockings, Elizabeth Montagu, wrote in 1769 that Shakespeare seems to have had the art of the devise in the Arabian Tales to throw his soul into the body of another man and be at once possessed of his sentiments, adopt his passions, and rise to all the functions and feelings of the situation. A long line of Shakespearean criticism has noted the absence of an authorial voice leading to an openness of interpretation. In 1802, Samuel Taylor Coleridge asked to send ourselves out of ourselves, to think ourselves into the thoughts and feelings of beings and circumstances wholly and strangely different from our own. Hoc labor, hoc opus, this is the work, this is the labor. Who has achieved it? Perhaps only Shakespeare. William Hazlitt characterized Shakespeare's silencing of his own voice as an out-of-body experience. The striking peculiarity of Shakespeare's mind was its generic quality, its power of communication with all other minds, so that it contained a universe of thought and feeling within itself and had no one peculiar bias or exclusive excellence more than another. He was just like any other man, but that he was like all other men. He was the least of an egoist that it was possible to be. He was nothing in himself, but he was all that others were, or that they could become. Hazlitt contrasted the self-effacing Shakespeare, whom I've dubbed an ironist, with an egoist, a term he associated with the self-centered poets of his own day, Wordsworth, who emphasized, in his words, the devouring egotism of the writer's own minds. Milton and Shakespeare did not so understand poetry. They gave a more liberal interpretation to nature and art. Hazlitt's word liberal here is important. So when Hazlitt was a boy, his father took him across the Atlantic in pursuit of liberty. The elder Hazlitt had studied with Adam Smith in Glasgow, became a dissenting minister, and thrilled to the American fight against kings. In 1783, he brought his 5-year-old son to Philadelphia, where republicanism and Puritanism walked hand in hand in the streets. Years later, Hazlitt remembered simply, quote, "In America, they have both." The family soon returned to the English village of Wem, where Hazlitt grew up among rational dissenters, religious outsiders, shaped by Milton, Locke, and Algernon Sidney, who preached that conscience and belief must never be ruled by the state. As a teenager, Hazlitt publicly defended the persecuted Unitarian minister, Joseph Priestley. He ultimately turned from his father's faith to atheism, yet Hazlitt kept the dissenter's passion for liberty. His essay on the principles of human action claimed that humans have a natural inclination for disinterestedness, an imagination which must carry me out of myself into the feelings of others. In London, Hazlitt fell in with Leigh Hunt, the imprisoned editor of The Examiner, whose day star of liberty shone through politics, poetry, and theater. So Hunt loved Shakespeare and Milton as champions of freedom, and Hazlitt agreed, but in Shakespeare he found something even more radical than Republican political slogans. He found a dramatic world where no voice, not king, priest, or even author, had the last word. Shakespeare's art, for Hazlitt, felt like liberty. John Keats was also a child of dissent, so at 7 years old, Keats arrived at Clark's Academy in Enfield, a school founded by Baptists fiercely proud of England's history of resistance to tyranny. There he absorbs Burnet's History of the Revolution and the latest issues of Hunt's Examiners. Classmates said he was, quote, skeptical and Republican, a fault finder of anything that smelled of old privilege. So before he was famous, Keats writes some bitter lines on the restoration of Charles II. In sonnets, he begs England not to crawl back to sceptered tyrants, urging, quote, give thy kings law. When Hunt walked free from prison, Keats greeted him as a modern Milton and dedicated his first book to him, framing his poems with Shakespeare's image and an epigraph from Spenser celebrating delight with liberty. I would argue that Shakespeare's canonization resulted from a confluence between his strategy as an author and the political commitments of his canonizers. Specifically, Shakespeare's ironic mode made his drama uniquely appealing to the political liberals at the forefront of English culture in the 19th century. Both Shakespeare and his canonizers were anti-authoritarian. The literary version of anti-authoritarianism in Shakespeare's drama, which I call irony, was a perfect match for those who subscribed to the political version of anti-authoritarianism, liberalism, advocated by the likes of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Thus Keats writes, it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously, I mean negative capability. That is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Probably the most famous sentence ever written about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's capability was negative because he negated his own ideas, attitudes, beliefs, perspectives, and identities to embody and represent others. Like Hazlitt, Keats hated didactic poetry that they got from the Romantics. Are we to be bullied into a certain philosophy engendered in the whims of an egotist? We hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us, and if we do not agree, seems to put its hand in its breeches pocket. So that's my favorite all-time sentence of literary criticism. In 1807, the first Shakespeare adaptation for children is published. It's called Tales from Shakespeare. There's now many examples, such as The Lion King, which is based on Hamlet. Shakespeare has been a darling of German philosophers, including Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. The British Empire continued its imperial project in the Victorian age, Shakespeare serving as a symbol for the greatness of Great Britain. Shakespeare sets the stage for the earliest black actors in Britain, Ira Aldridge, but there are also some terrible traditions of Shakespearean blackface, including this voodoo witch doctor from Edmund McKean in the 18th century, and as recent as Anthony Hopkins' blackface Othello in 1981. The 19th century saw a flurry of Shakespeare across the academic disciplines. The natural history of the insects mentioned in Shakespeare's plays, notes upon the reptiles mentioned in Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare's legal acquirements considered, the medical knowledge of Shakespeare, the wild flowers of Shakespeare, the birds of Shakespeare, the meteorology of Shakespeare. Darwin used Shakespeare in his book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals from 1872. In 1840, Thomas Carlyle said, of this Shakespeare of ours, perhaps the opinion one hears sometimes a little idolatrously espoused is in fact the right one. I think the best judgment not only of this country but of Europe at large is slowly pointing to the conclusion that Shakespeare is the chief of all poets hitherto, the greatest intellect who in our recorded world has left record of himself in the way of literature. Women's Shakespeare reading clubs were at the forefront of the American suffrage movement in the 19th century. Shakespeare has inspired some of our most well-known music. So that's Felix Mendelssohn's Wedding March from A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1842. In 1847, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust was established, the beginning of Shakespeare tourism. The Astor Place riot occurred on May 10, 1849 in Manhattan. It was a dispute over who played Macbeth better, Edwin Forrest, the American, or William Charles Macready, the Englishman. Estimates are that between 22 and 31 people died. In 1857, Delia Bacon claimed a commoner like Shakespeare could never have written those amazing plays, inaugurating the Shakespeare authorship controversy. Abraham Lincoln worried that he would turn into Macbeth. John Wilkes Booth saw his cause in Julius Caesar. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre was opened in 1879. The Shakespeare Memorial Room in the Birmingham Library was built in 1882. Shakespeare was at the center of the civic gospel of Birmingham reformer George Dawson, who called Shakespeare the meeting point of all races and genders. Shakespeare is well represented in opera, such as Verdi's Falstaff in 1893. In 1898, Nicaraguan poet Ruben Dario described U.S. culture and imperialism as the triumph of Caliban. Shakespeare was popular in early silent film, such as The King John from 1899. How can you have silent film Shakespeare? I thought the words were the point. But it's precisely because the words were so well known that you can have silent film Shakespeare. In 1901, G.B. Shaw complained it was the age of gross ignorance of Shakespeare and incapacity for his works that produced the indiscriminate eulogies with which we are familiar. It was the revival of serious attention to those works that coincided with the movement for giving genuine instead of spurious and silly representations of his plays. So much for bardolatry. So Shaw closes the door on Shakespeare worship at least. But Shakespeare is loved by the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, so Hamlet helps him theorize the Oedipus complex. Shakespeare's been both a foe and a friend of feminism, seen as a privileged man by Virginia Woolf and as a proto-feminist by Juliet Duesenberg. The Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. is built in 1932. In the 1930s, Paul Robeson's Othello is the first black character to kiss a white character on a major American stage. The Nazis saw their values in Shakespeare. Shakespeare showed up in Mexican cinema, as here with Cantinflas. We see Shakespeare's popularity decline during the World Wars and then climb back up in post-war periods because people aren't reading Shakespeare when they're out fighting wars. In the mid-20th century, Laurence Olivier made several popular Shakespeare films. Here's Henry V, Hamlet, and Richard III. I want to note the Richard III image I grabbed from a site called crazyeyes.com. The New York Shakespeare Festival, later known as Shakespeare in the Park, began in 1954. He's been adapted into science fiction, like Forbidden Planet, based on The Tempest in space. Adaptations from Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa create space for cross-cultural conversation, so this is Throne of Blood, based on Macbeth, The Bad Sleep Well, based on Hamlet, and Ron, based on King Lear. African-American writers such as James Baldwin and Maya Angelou saw civil rights struggles in Shakespeare. He's been filtered through existentialism, as in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Anti-apartheid South Africans saw Shakespeare in their movement. Laura Bohannon's 1966 essay, Shakespeare in the Book, an American anthropologist set out to study the Tiv of West Africa and was taught the true meaning of Hamlet, became an influential text in cultural anthropology. Sometimes scholars in far-flung fields obnoxiously cite Shakespeare's quotable quotes out of context, but there's also a more compelling story to be told of Shakespeare both receiving and generating new knowledge in areas outside of literary studies. When theater was outlawed because it gathered dissidents in communist Czechoslovakia, Pavel Kahoot staged Macbeth in his friend's living room under surveillance from police outside the apartment. Shakespeare's popularity in China skyrockets after the end of the Cultural Revolution. In 1972, three psychologists theorized the Romeo and Juliet effect, which holds that, quote, parental influence in a love relationship intensifies the feelings of romantic love between members of the couple. architect of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, Osama bin Laden's journal, says that he first decided the West was unholy in a trip to Shakespeare's birthplace as a teenager in the 1970s. The Tempest has provided a platform for queer sexuality in the films of Derek Jarman and Peter Greenaway. The American Shakespeare Center opens in 1988. In the Google Ngram, Shakespeare's popularity peaks in the 1890s and then again in the 1950s. It then takes this interesting downward turn in the third quarter of the 20th century, but then it rebounds starting in the 1980s and now is just as wide as ever. Starting with Henry V in 1989, Kenneth Branagh has done several big-budget Hollywood Shakespeare films. In the 1990s, literary critic Harold Bloom said that Shakespeare is the center of the canon. At once, no one and everyone, nothing and everything, Shakespeare is the Western canon, for better or worse. Donald Trump's chief political strategist, Steve Bannon, wrote 2 Shakespeare adaptations in the 1990s, Titus Andronicus in Space and a hip-hop musical of Coriolanus. Hollywood Shakespeare films like Romeo and Juliet and 10 Things I Hate About You were all the rage in the 1990s. A replica of Shakespeare's Globe was rebuilt in London in 1997. And in 1999, Shakespeare is voted Personality of the Millennium, which is kind of odd for someone who so methodically left his personality out of his work. The Donkey Show is based on A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's been a staple of the LGBTQ plus experience in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 25 years. There's an entire industry of Shakespeare study aids. There are sports-inflected Shakespeare films such as O in 2001 and She's the Man in 2006, which pose questions of race and gender for teen audiences. The Kuwaiti playwright Suleiman al-Bassam has adapted several Shakespeare plays to Arab contexts, Hamlet, Richard III, and I forget the third. It's one of the comedies, sorry. There's the apparently thriving Shakespearean porn industry with titles like A Midsummer Night's Cream. I've got a fantastic story to tell you about this if you want. Psychologists have theorized the Macbeth effect, in which, quote, a threat to one's moral purity induces the need to cleanse oneself. The X-Men franchise is stuffed with Shakespearean actors. The 4 who have played Magneto and Professor X have all been Macbeth. Shakespeare has helped reform incarcerated criminals, as portrayed in the Shakespeare Behind Bars film. Shakespearean insult generators are available on the internet. Shakespeare is used in medical schools to teach disease, disability, and better bedside manner. The hip-hop artist Akala affirms a place for Shakespeare in rap music in the Western canon by pointing out that you often can't tell the difference between Shakespeare and rap lyrics. Sign languages have illustrated their vibrancy by translating Shakespeare. This is Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Shakespeare has been a major presence in Indian cinema. These are adaptations from Vishal Bhardwaj, Makbul from Macbeth, Omkara from Othello, and Hayter from Hamlet. Adaptations recover the voice of silenced characters, as in Lisa Klein's Ophelia, 2008, and Toni Morrison's Desdemona, 2011. In 2012, archaeologist Chris Thomas discovers the remains of Shakespeare's early curtain theater. In 2013, neurologists used MRI technology to show that Shakespeare's frequent use of functional shifts, using nouns as verbs, sends our brains into overdrive as they try to figure out the meaning of what's being said. There is the magnificently titled Discourse of Shakespeare, exploring non-binary sexuality. There's avant-garde theater like Cry Trojans, where 2 different acting companies play the warring Greeks and Trojans from Troilus and Cressida. Immersive theater such as Sleep No More, an adaptation of Macbeth done in different rooms in a hotel that you walk through. Such Sweet Sorrow was Romeo and Juliet, performed on Twitter. The documentary Still Dreaming shows Shakespeare helping elderly actors maintain a sense of value and achievement. There's Naked Shakespeare. There's Drunk Shakespeare, where actors see how long into their bender they can remember their lines. People have written environmental activism into Shakespearean performances. New plays exposing the nerve endings of identity, such as Benali's Yasser, Keith Hamilton Cobb's American Moor, and Morgan Lloyd Malcolm's Amelia, cull problems from Shakespeare's works, leveraging his cultural capital for progressive responses. The argument holding many of these stories together is that Shakespeare is popular not because his texts are better than others, but because they're more problematic. Textually, thematically, and ethically, they are rife with difficult questions attracting massive attention, most especially in proclaiming freedom of interpretation to audiences while perpetuating structural and social inequalities. Shakespeare's dramatic artistically enacts the qualities of English liberalism both its virtues and its vices. That's why modern England chose Shakespeare as its cultural figurehead, and why Shakespeare and liberalism manifest similar controversies today. The opening ceremonies of the 2012 London Olympics, which was an absolute mess, by the way, was based on the line from Shakespeare's The Tempest, "The Isle is full of noises." There were massive celebrations in 2016 for Shakespeare's 450th birthday. One group wanted to set a world record on Shakespeare's birthday, so they chartered a plane to perform Shakespeare's play at the highest elevation it had ever been performed before, as if anyone would ever try to break this record. They called it magnificently Shakes on a Plane.
We've tracked down the oldest living William Shakespeare, so a 91-year-old William Shakespeare, who's come down with us today to celebrate the event. And he's been tremendously good fun, with great energy.
He's wonderful. Wonderful to have his name. His writing, his books, his poems. Clever man. Clever man.
This has just made not his day, his life. I mean, he's been so excited. And I think he feels that he's doing something worthwhile as well, so that really makes a difference.
So we have a special William Shakespeare plane. We've called it Romeo Alpha Juliet, so Romeo and Juliet, after the famous play, and Shakespeare's name and face on the side of it. And this will fly all over Europe over the coming months.
I mean, just look at that. It is wonderful. And of course, the sign at the front is Romeo Alpha Juliet. What a fantastic idea.
The British government paid £1.5 million to have Shakespeare's works translated into Mandarin. Starting in 2014, the Hamlet Globe to Globe World Tour lasted over 2 years, visiting 197 countries to perform this play. The BBC rode the wave of Game of Thrones to produce lush films of Shakespeare's history plays. There's the Hogarth Shakespeare series, where prominent novelists rewrite Shakespeare's plots in modern settings. And then there's the Shakes memes, where quotes from the plays gloss current events. Days after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, students at the University of Pennsylvania protest Trump by tearing down a portrait of Shakespeare. The rise of Donald Trump has drawn comparisons to the Netflix hit House of Cards, based on Shakespeare's Richard III, and in summer 2017, the assassination of a Trump-esque Julius Caesar led corporate sponsors to pull out of the famed Shakespeare in the Park in New York City. Shakespeare remains popular because, at a time when the English is the most common language in the world, Shakespeare's works are the English language's best mechanism for thinking about the past in relation to the present, the private in relation to the public, and the tragic in relation to the comic. It was international news in 2017 when the Oxford Shakespeare announced they were crediting as co-authors on nearly half of Shakespeare's plays. In 2018, UNESCO granted documents about Shakespeare's life the same preservation status as the Magna Carta. There are Hamlet video games. Shakespeare has been used as trauma therapy for veterans. Recent years have seen all-black productions of Richard II, Much Ado About Nothing, and Measure for Measure. And there were, of course, Zoom performances during the coronavirus lockdown. Which brings us to today, April 23rd, Shakespeare's birthday, which one group has dubbed Talk Like Shakespeare Day.
Go Willie, it's your birthday. Go Willie, it's your birthday. Heidi Hither, it's your birthday. And you know we don't give us blood cause it's your birthday. Happy birthday to thee. Happy birthday to thou. Happy birthday, Willie Shakespeare. Let us party it right now. Yo, what up, G?
I have to, it's so bad. It's like socially awkward bad. It's like the world is now a worse place because we know that exists. Thank you all very much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilson, and we will open it up for some Q&A and see what the audience, how the audience feels about Shakespeare. Why I want to know. Oh, there you go.
Now is it working? Now it's working. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I'm curious, without taking anything away from all the wonder of Shakespeare. I'm not saying I'm not a naysayer at all, but isn't it also true that Shakespeare is popular because Shakespeare is popular? I mean, isn't there like a self-fulfilling aspect. We're in an echo chamber of Shakespeare is popular, therefore Shakespeare is good for us. Shakespeare used the expression cultural capital towards the end, but I mean, isn't Shakespeare, a way to assure cultural capital is associated with all the millions of things we can do and get away with using him for?
Yeah, it's certainly true that Shakespeare becomes kind of a self-running automaton at a certain point from the cultural prominence that he has. But there's also a question about, it could have been anyone. It had to at least come from somewhere. It had to start someplace before it became self-sustaining. And so that's where, for me, it's at least interesting to think about. That moment was really the start of the 19th century. And so what led to Shakespeare being chosen up to that moment? But then what are the consequences of Shakespeare being chosen? One of which is becoming this safe, self-sustaining cultural phenomenon. And then another consequence, we saw a couple examples of this, is Shakespeare then radiating out into all of these media, which he really has no business being in, such as painting, such as silent film, such as opera. But you can only use Shakespeare in those non or low linguistic art forms if the language is already widely known. That there's sort of, it relies upon Shakespeare's cultural prominence for that artwork to even exist.
Thank you. You touched very lightly on Shakespeare collaborations with other authors. There was recently something actually on Stephen Colbert, the actor Ian McKellen, talked about the play that was discovered fairly recently, and I believe contains the only known sample of, I can't read it from here, but okay. Can you elaborate a little bit more about his collaborations, and in particular this one, because it's well known today?
Sure. There's probably two phases to this story. So the first phase is the 1590s, which we talked about a little bit with the history plays. And I at least am fully convinced that the reason that Shakespeare is the one we remember is, yes, he was very good with words. Yes, he was a fantastic artist, but he was a fantastic collaborator. That's really what separates Shakespeare in the 1590s from these other folks. So at the start of the 1590s, writing history plays was a collaborative project, and everyone was involved in it. And then by the end of the 1590s, Shakespeare's clearly emerged as basically the CEO of that. And so he's the person who is organizing the groups that are doing the collaboration, and then he's the person who emerges out of that to write solely authored plays such as Richard II, Henry V. So I really think it is that Shakespeare was extremely good at teamwork, and that teamwork allowed sort of talent to rise to the top, as we see happening in organizations all the time, right? That the folks who we really love to work with are the ones who are good at teamwork. So that's the story in the 1590s. That then 1603 is about the time that you're thinking of Sir Thomas More. So this is the background here. It's called Hand D, which is one of the very few, perhaps the only surviving documents that has Shakespeare's handwriting in it. We know through stylometric analysis which scenes in Sir Thomas More, which was written by about 8 different people, we know through stylometric analysis who wrote which scenes. And because we know who wrote which scenes, and we know which scene this is, we have the handwriting in Hand D. There's hands A, B, C, D, E, F. We think that this is probably Shakespeare's handwriting. So that was very much a case of Shakespeare had become a celebrity by that point. And at least my read on Sir Thomas More is they get to this really important moment in the play. And it's this moment where there's a riot that's starting out in London, and this would have been the moment that Ian McKellen talked about with Colbert. That Londoners are rioting because immigrants are coming in and taking their jobs. And they need a scene where Thomas More, the sheriff, comes to town and says, look, what would you do if you were the stranger who was arriving on the shorelines in a place that you've never been before? How would you want them to treat you? So they need that moment. And it's pretty clear, I think, that there was some thought and some conversation that Shakespeare would be the right person to write this moment. There's a sense of kind of like a celebrity script doctor coming in for the scene that only Shakespeare could write, which again, sort of, he had to have that cultural prominence established by that point for him to be the one that got the call in that moment. But he also had to do the really good collaborative work in the 1590s earlier to gain that cultural status.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I wonder if you maybe put in too sharp, I don't want to attribute a position you didn't hold, but you put in too sharp opposition the qualities, the literary qualities on the one hand, and then the ways in which we encounter and articulate, the way I would put it, articulation of the constitutive tensions of modernity, basically, right? The private, the public, and all that. I wonder if there's a real dynamic, intimate relationship between the two, such that the artistic qualities are precisely because of the sensitivity to the radical transformation, and he's groping for a language in which to articulate those. And so there's a really complex dynamic interplay, so you can't go with an either or there.
Yeah, it's certainly true that it would be the case. I think what I would say is the thing that jumps out to me about Shakespeare's quote-unquote liberalism is not that it's content for his plays. You know, he's writing plays all about kings. That's almost all that he talks about is monarchy. He's very often shows the tragedy that comes out of monarchy, and in that you could and people have, such as Andrew Hadfield, make the claim that Shakespeare has a Republican sentiment to him, a freedom-loving sentiment to him. For me, at least, that's not the liberalism in Shakespeare that matters. What matters is the way that he works as an author of literature, and there it's that. If the analogy to say, governor of a state is someone who's going to have a strong hand and control the way that the citizens in the state operate, that's going to be a more authoritarian approach versus someone who's going to have a reserved position and allow people to, pursue the greatest good for the greatest number of people while doing the least amount of harm possible, then that's going to be a more restrained kind of classical liberal position. And I guess the fascinating thing would be to see if that Republican content that was clearly in the air in Shakespeare's time, people were having those ideas, the ideas from the classical age were being reborn. Was there a mechanism by which that content would be transferred over to method? And who knows?
Hi. First of all, I just want to say that was a very engaging presentation. Thank you so much. Something that I really wanted to know, because I've read a couple articles on this, is what influence did Shakespeare have, take from other cultures? I've heard a lot about, origins, from the Middle East, and I wonder if, there's any depth to that, or if they're just theories.
There's a there. So Shakespeare's most direct cultural inheritances come from ancient Latin, and then behind that ancient Greece. But the way in which the classical texts made their way to 16th century England was through the Middle East. That it was the universities there that preserved those texts largely, and so their ideas from there filtered into it some. I think it's probably fair to say that Shakespeare and most representations of Middle Easterners was what we would now call Orientalist. That's the sort of the dynamic of the representation. And that's what creates this fascinating dynamic for modern folks who come from those backgrounds of, do you even engage with Shakespeare and try to speak back to Shakespeare, or do you just let it go and get away from it and go on to something that is sort of organically more virtuous in your eyes?
Did you have a question? Any other questions or comments?
Hi. I also really loved your lecture. I have just a quick question. What is your favorite Shakespeare work? play specifically. I just love to know out of my own curiosity.
So it's got to be Richard III. Richard III is a fantastic play where the protagonist comes out and tells you at the very start of the play that he's going to be an evil villain. Tells you this. And what happens in the first 2 acts of Richard III is that you fall in love with this guy because he is a good time. Like, you have fun with him. And then you get to Act 4 and suddenly you're murdering children and you're saying, oh, I've got myself mixed up in something that's not quite right here. And then you have to wrestle with that. That seems to be just an artistically really, really powerful play for Shakespeare to do that with. So I wrote a book about Richard III that took 15 years to write. That basically, my first year in grad school, I wrote a paper about the reception history of Richard III, and it got a really good response from my teacher, and then that consumed me for 15 years. So teachers, be careful when you give praise on papers.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed your presentation. I'm just wondering, like, if irony is kind of like the main modern driving factor that keeps Shakespeare relevant. Like, I know we started the conversation with why Shakespeare is used in high schools. What hope maybe could you offer for those of us who maybe have a soft spot for, like, people maybe you wouldn't consider ironists, of like Chaucer or Milton? I don't know, like, to what extent you would classify him like that, or Spencer. Like, are they just doomed to be like relegated to graduate school departments, or like is there any hope that a high schooler could like enjoy any of those works?
No, absolutely. And I think, at least the way that I think about it, is that especially those for Chaucer, Spencer, Shakespeare, Milton have levels of irony going on at different levels. That Shakespeare is the most ironic, and the reason for that is really that with Shakespeare, irony is, again, form, not content, by which I mean that it's the shift from poetry to drama. So with drama, in poetry, at some level, and this is the argument about Milton, is that Milton's Paradise Lost is an extremely skeptical, extremely critical poem where there are things going on, but at some level there is a narrative, authorial voice that is coming through to say, and God is good. With a drama, you just got a few people on stage who are having a conversation, and increasingly in Shakespeare's career, those conversations about the divine, for example, are not staged. We don't see devils brought out on stage, but they're reported, which means that in the same way that all of us, if we make a claim to have interacted with the divine, we don't see the divine represented, but in the idea of faith is the belief of things without evidence, that those are reported conversations. So I guess a long-winded way of saying that, especially Chaucer, Spencer, Shakespeare, Milton, I think there are levels of irony there. With Milton, it's certainly the most prominent. With Milton, you get probably the fullest articulation of what I would call liberal content, which is to say, Milton participated in the killing of a king. But with Shakespeare, it's that shift into a form of literature in which there is fundamentally no authority controlling the meaning of things, and that's where Shakespeare continues to appeal to us.
All right, final question, Professor Kumar.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really entertaining and quite insightful. At the beginning, you said something about Shakespeare understanding the human condition, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about what is it that he understood that other writers, what did he understand about the human condition that perhaps other writers of his time did not quite grasp or get into? I'm curious about this idea of the human condition.
I would just say I'd be interested to know sort of the moment you're referring to. I certainly would not think that Shakespeare has any particularly good insight on the human condition. Harold Bloom certainly does. Harold Bloom said that Shakespeare invented human beings. And by the way, what Harold Bloom means when he says that is that human beings didn't exist until the 1590s. by that Harold Bloom means sort of interiority, as Shakespeare invented interiority, which is a complete bogus claim. So I wouldn't have much for you there in terms of Shakespeare's insight on the human condition. I would say not terribly much. I would say that Shakespeare frequently lampooned people who made claims about the human condition, and that, for me, that's maybe what his core insight is about it.
Thank you. Let's give a final applause for Professor Jeffrey Wilson. All right. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to the Center for Humanities. There's board members here. Thank you to our tech team. And please enjoy a cookie or a cupcake in honor of Mr. Shakespeare's birthday. Thank you.